2024, an election year like no other. From the candidates to the issues, from voter integrity and analysis, we'll discuss debates, trends, patterns, election laws, and more. This is Vote 2024, Path to the Polls.
There are potholes ahead on the road to the White House for both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. For Harris, it is realizing honeymoons don't last. For Donald Trump, it's that it's time for a campaign reboot. And most analysts will tell you, as well as many within his own campaign, they don't know how to get there. With the ticket set, both VP Kamala Harris and her running mate, Governor Tim Walz, and former President Trump and Senator J.D. Vance, they must decide how to approach voters and the campaign trail. Both camps must better define their campaign strategies. Now Donald Trump wants 3 debates with Kamala Harris. Those debates may be pivotal. The call from Trump is very telling. And the fact that Harris sometimes falters when asked tough questions puts her on the spot. Though she is a savvier politician these days than in the past, but it does provide some interesting new twists to an already extraordinary campaign. And then there's this bombshell from President Biden. He is not confident, he says, of a peaceful transition of power if Donald Trump loses the election. And we can't ignore the Senate races. Sure, we saw Senate Democrats in tough re-election contests in battleground states return to the campaign trail. Kamala Harris brought them back. They were tough to find in July at Joe Biden's campaign event. May show how much the race has changed. But even if Harris wins in November, the Democrats face a major challenge in retaining control of the Senate. I'm Bruce Hamilton. Welcome to Path to the Polls. And joining me for this edition, News4Jack's political analyst and head of the Jacksonville University Public Policy Institute, my friend Rick Mullaney. Rick, good to have you here as always. Appreciate it.
Good morning, Bruce. Great to be with you.
So let's talk about this. Start by trying to figure out the campaign strategies. Harris and Walz came out of the chute with a much different tone than the Trump campaign. The Harris camp seems to have taken what's being called the joyful warrior approach, but Harris still has to broaden it. And the challenge is, does she practice the sort of defensive politics that Clinton and Obama mastered in different decades, of course, to reassure America they were no radicals? Or as one analyst put it, will she adopt a new fit-for-Trumpian times model of simply rousing core supporters and betting contempt for the opposition will carry the day? What do you think?
I think it's going to be a combination of both of those strategies, but I wouldn't confuse this strategy with trying to broaden the appeal. I think what's happened very effectively in the Harris campaign is they have played to the base. And that base includes some important groups, not only the progressive wing of the party, but the youth vote, the black vote, and of course, women. And what the Harris campaign has done, particularly with the selection of Walz, is that they have stopped the bleeding from the Biden campaign. In the Biden campaign, when he was running for president, they were having tremendous challenges with the base, with the youth vote. They didn't know where they were going, with the black vote that was bleeding over to Donald Trump, with women. Now what you've seen since Kamala Harris has had the nomination, she is enjoying a very good run. And they have been operating very smartly, I think, politically. In general, although they're getting criticized by the Republicans for this, it has been a very upbeat, forward-looking, and there's been a lot of excitement. There is euphoria on the Democratic side that it's not Joe Biden, and I don't mean that to be disparaging towards Joe Biden, but I think many Democrats thought all was lost. They no longer think that. They think they have a great chance with Kamala Harris. They're finding someone who is very effective in front of those crowds. They like the selection of the governor of Minnesota, and so they're now on a run. But if the question is, are they going to try to broaden it to the middle? They're certainly going to work hard in those blue wall states. But for now, his selection signaled the base. We're going to go to our progressive base. We're going to have that bleeding stop, and we're going to turn out our voters. So far, it's been a very effective strategy for the Harris campaign.
And I think the key there, as you said, for now, and the polls certainly seem to reflect that. Not that they place much value in the polls because, well, we know what have happened with polls in the past. So it's also been suggested that they frame the campaign as not just joyful warrior, but also as a celebration of America. A good act? And how do you think it would play?
The answer is it's a good act for now. And she's going to enjoy the momentum through the Democratic convention next week. But it will be game on post-Labor Day, particularly when it comes to the debate on September 10th. For now, Kamala Harris has enjoyed a run in which, of course, she has not done any interviews. As she says, she may do one interview maybe by the end of this month. She's not done a debate. Donald Trump has challenged her to 3. She has agreed to 1. I'd be surprised if she does more than 1 for lots and lots of reasons. So for now, that upbeat, forward-looking optimistic view is a great approach for the honeymoon period and through the Democratic convention next week. And for Kamala Harris, what she wants to do is to redefine herself before the Trump campaign and the Republicans can define her. And so far, on this battle of who defines who, she's kind of got the edge on that going on right now.
She was asked, will you do more debates? And she kind of hedged on it. Donald Trump has criticized her for not doing news conferences, as had J.D. Vance. And we'll talk more about that coming up, because if you look at her past, she's not been very strong. And again, more discussion on that. And looking at her choice of Tim Walz, he's going to have to help her broaden her appeal for them to prevail in November. And that's a large task.
It is. And as I said earlier, I'm not so sure his selection signals a broadening of an appeal, but of bringing the base home. And in particular, she's got excitement with young voters right now. She is consolidating the black vote. Women like what she's doing. Where he can be helpful, of course, is in that blue wall. Now, remember, he's from Minnesota. Minnesota has gone for a Democrat every year since 1976. It's not as though, unlike Shapiro, who might have brought in Pennsylvania, they weren't worried about Minnesota. But they like his style, his background, his resume, and they can hopefully broaden his appeal in those blue wall states. But overall, the Harris strategy has been bring the base home, turn out the base, generate excitement, and as you said earlier, the parts about Donald Trump being unacceptable, hope that those undecided voters will say, well, this is a thinkable alternative, the other one is not. Let's go on the Harris side.
And there were a lot of people who were actually surprised that she went with Walz because, number one, the announcement was made in Philadelphia. People said, oh, it's got to be Governor Shapiro because, 3 days before they said, well, we're going to be in Philly. And, it was a given. But apparently it was a last-minute decision because they said she got along very well with him. And they also thought that she wouldn't be overshadowed by him.
Bruce, a lot of that was in the thinking. Governor Shapiro would have been a very compelling choice for lots of reasons. Number one is Pennsylvania, a very popular governor, and who wins Pennsylvania goes a long way towards determining who wins this election. Number two, he's more centrist. And that's why I'm saying that the selection of Walz signals a different direction. There was not a desire here really to move to the center because he would have been more centrist. There's also concern maybe that he has presidential ambitions of his own, where Tim Walz does not. And there was a concern as a Jewish governor that maybe they were concerned when it comes to Israel, Hamas, and particularly with those Michigan voters. So this was a tough choice. Many were pleased, wanted her to see her go with Josh Shapiro. What's interesting when you step back, both on the Republican side and the Democratic side, they made selections that played more to their base than to the middle. On the Republican side, the choice of Vance was really playing to that MAGA base. He's very popular with the base. On the Democratic side, the choice of Walz is very positive with that progressive base. So we're going to have to see what happens in the middle.
Though it's interesting because if you listen to Shapiro and even Mark Kelly, they will say, we've got work to do in our respective states, so we're going to stay put where we are. But then that's politics. Now, part of the thinking is that Walz could provide a decisive boost in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, 3 states that if Democrats can hold on to them would make their ticket highly likely to win.
If they win those 3 states, they're going to win. And those are critical states. Now, the thinking with Vance, of course, he's from Ohio. He's not from necessarily a swing state. But because of his blue-collar roots, because of his Appalachian roots, that he also would be able to campaign effectively in those states. We'll have to wait and see. And the selection of Walz, also for that very same reason. There is an obvious recognition that the 44 electoral votes represented by those 3 states are critical to the outcome of this race. And the Republicans have to win at least one of those states. If you see a sweep by the Democrats, you're going to see a Democratic president. They are hoping that his style, his resume, his background, his public speaking, which is really good for the governor of Minnesota, is going to help them in those states. They're also hoping on the Republican side that Vance will do that. But clearly there's a recognition that battle's going to be fought there. It's so interesting, Bruce. Over 150 million votes will be cast in November. But in the end, it's going to come down to about 100,000, maybe 200,000 voters in a few swing states, but particularly in those 3 that are going to determine the outcome of this election.
Does that sound familiar to you?
It does sound familiar. In 2020, despite a $4 to $5 million popular vote total for Joe Biden, it was about 40,000 votes that separated Donald Trump from Joe Biden in the last election. When you take a look at those swing states, if 40,000 had gone the other way, Donald Trump would have won in 2020, which tells you just how critical in the Electoral College those swing states really are.
I think it was 8 years ago on an election night that you and I sat here in this very studio. We were looking at how close the vote was, and we were both like, what?
It was, in 2016, it was stunning, and you saw Donald Trump in very thin margins go into that blue wall, something that certainly Mitt Romney was unable to do before, and it really was decisive for Donald Trump in 2016, and it was decisive for Joe Biden in 2020. As you look to your crystal ball in November, as those 3 states go, really critical part of who's going to be in the White House.
It's interesting because that just came as a flashback to me just now. And the look that you and I gave each other, we didn't say a word, but it spoke volumes. One of the Democrats' chief challenges in the states we just mentioned, and you talked about the blue collar and small town areas where the party once ran competitively before the floor fell out amid and after Donald Trump's emergence in 2016. The thinking is that Walz's story and style is going to be relatable and reassuring to some of those voters. You think it will be?
In the end, it's a great story, it's a great style, but the track record suggests that those rural areas tend to be red, the urban areas tend to be blue. And if you look at his track record in the past, when he was elected for governor, it was in Minneapolis and those big urban areas. So whether it plays out in those rural parts of Minnesota, or less significantly there, because it's going to go to the Democratic side, if it goes to those rural areas, we're going to have to wait and see. But certainly the thinking is that his resume, a teacher, the National Guard, his service in Congress, all of that, he's a hunter, that's going to play well with those blue-collar voters and with those rural voters. That historically has not necessarily been the case, but for the future, that is the hope on the Democratic side.
But there is a catch here, though, and the catch is that Walz himself couldn't do that in his last campaign, and he's going to need to break through what I call the Trump-era polarization in the kinds of places that he couldn't do in what was it, 2022 for himself.
That's a really good example. When he ran for Congress, he was actually from somewhat of a red district, and he was more centrist. And when he went to Congress, relatively centrist record. But once he was elected governor in Minnesota, and once he got a Democratic majority in Minnesota, a very progressive agenda on spending, on taxes, on a variety of issues. And one of the great vulnerabilities of the Harris ticket, quite frankly, is the record for the governor and for Kamala Harris as a United States Senator. And where the Republicans so far have not been able to execute their strategy is to focus heavily on that policy record for Kamala Harris and to tie her to the Biden record and to contrast it with Donald Trump's record as president. And I think that's where they're trying to get, but they certainly haven't been able to go there so far.
Okay, so that's a good point to go ahead and turn our attention now to the Trump campaign. Trump-Vance ticket has yet to figure things out and to decide if the old line of attack is working or if it's time to develop new links of embarkation. Or have they decided and they plan to go with the same old and pave the political road with insults and not worry about the fact that fact-checking things doesn't matter?
Bruce, in the end, Donald Trump can win this election. One of the big questions is, does he have the discipline to win this election? And by discipline, what I mean is, I don't think there's a mystery here as to what his strategy is. The problem is, does he have the execution and the discipline to do it? For example, he goes to Georgia, a critical state if he wants to be president of the United States. And there, he goes after Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, who is a popular governor, who, by the way, has the ability to pardon him for the state charges there, and who has endorsed him, and he goes on the attack in a critical state. That is, in my opinion, a lack of discipline. With Kamala Harris, he brings up the issue of what point he brings in race and gender. That is a lack of discipline. The insults to a lack of discipline. Where he does have a strategy in trying to define her, and they've helped with his appointment, is to define her, as the Republican Party has, as a far-left ticket, one of those most far-left tickets in the history of the country, and point to her record as a senator, from fracking, where she favored banning fracking, private health insurance, in which she wanted to abolish private health insurance, defund the police, which she favored. And the list goes on when she was senator. And then, of course, the big 3 policies and tie her to the Biden record. That means inflation, and the historic over the last 40 years. It means immigration, in which she's been called the border czar and very ineffective in their view as to what's happened, and, of course, energy policy and crime. But instead of talking about the Biden record and the Harris record, Donald Trump, I think, so far at least, has not been able to execute on a strategy to use those records to contrast it with his time as president and then to look to the future. So have they been able to execute well so far? Not really. Will they in the future? I think that's one of the big questions.
And from what I understand, and from my sources inside the Republican campaign, they want him to attack her on those very issues because they think it will be more effective and it'll resonate with the electorate.
I think Donald Trump has shown in the past past that when he follows his campaign strategy and is more disciplined, he's more successful. And maybe the biggest example of that was in the last presidential debate, in which he was more disciplined. And when Joe Biden post-debate was struggling, a disciplined silence for about 12 days when Joe Biden was struggling. Instead, what you've seen is that Donald Trump has not been able to be consistent and on message. If he stays on message, I believe he has a chance to be very successful because this is a very competitive race. But there is a battle going on to define Kamala Harris. Do the Republicans define her, or does she define herself? So far, she's winning that battle. She will continue, in my opinion, in this honeymoon period through the Democratic convention next week. And then you're going to see a very short runway to Election Day. So it is really going to be game on, a very competitive race. At this point in time, I believe it's a toss-up. Either side could win.
Do you think Joe Biden dropping out of the race threw him off balance, and choosing Walsh threw him off balance?
I think the answer is yes, and it shouldn't have. Yes, it did throw him off balance, and I think they should have anticipated that. In some of their comments, they sort of knew it was coming. They clearly had to know it was coming. The rest of the nation knew it was coming, but they didn't find their footing early. I think they're starting to find their footing a little bit now. I think they were expecting it to be Shapiro, and quite frankly, among many Republicans, they were pleased that they didn't pick Shapiro, just as many Democrats are pleased that Donald Trump picked Vance. And so this is a case in which Republicans and Democrats sort of disagree on that vice presidential pick. But in the end, I don't think the vice presidential pick, historically or otherwise, really doesn't matter that much. It's the top.
Even J.D. Vance said that.
It's the top of the ticket. So we are in the midst, in my opinion, of one of the most interesting presidential races in the history of the country. We have experienced a summer unlike any summer in the history of the country. And they will be talking about this race, I believe, for decades to come. It has been stunning with Joe Biden and the debate, with him dropping out of the race, the attempted assassination attempt, the nomination of Kamala Harris, rulings from the U.S. Supreme Court and how all that affects things. It has been an incredible summer. And get ready for a very competitive race as we head to November.
If you're at the Public Policy Institute and the head 50 years from now, or a political science professor 50 years from now, what do you think the study would be like of this campaign?
Oh, I think this is going to be looked at for decades to come as one of the most remarkable inflection points in our country's history and one of the most remarkable races we've ever seen. We've seen things this year that we've never seen before. It started out with the two oldest candidates in history. And then it started with the earliest debate in history. And quite frankly, I think historians will say that the debate in June of 2024 changed the course of history. And it really did. Can you imagine if that debate had been in September after the Democratic convention as opposed to June before the Democratic convention, leaving the Democrats sufficient time to change directions and to make this a very competitive race. This will be dissected for years to come. And by the way, the future hangs in the balance, as both parties say, a very consequential election with two different visions for the future.
I've got to ask you another question. I didn't really think about this until I was having a discussion with my brother yesterday. Donald Trump keeps harping on the fact, I got more votes than Joe Biden, which he didn't. Does he understand that the popular vote doesn't really mean anything?
I think the campaign is fully aware that this is about the Electoral College and not the popular vote. And that's why when you see the popular vote showing that it's a dead heat, that's actually advantaged Donald Trump. The Kamala Harris and the Democrats need to be winning in that popular vote to really be competitive, in part because of the disproportionate number of votes in California and New York. And in the swing states, that is where the battle is fought. That is where it's kind of a dead heat right now. Some polls giving a slight lead to Donald Trump, some other polls showing Kamala Harris. So you have to look at the trajectory of both campaigns. Right now, it's advantaged Kamala Harris. But some of this may be the carryover momentum, the euphoria of Joe Biden dropping out. I expect this to shift back somewhat to the Trump side. And are they going to be disciplined enough to run their campaign effectively? No clear answer on that.
There isn't. Nobody has a crystal ball either. When Path to the Polls continues, Trump's call for 3 debates, which we were talking about, and how that may prove in the campaign. And beyond the White House, control of the Senate, a major concern for both parties. That and more when we come back. Welcome back to Path to the Polls. Bruce Hamilton, Rick Mullaney, News4Jax political analyst and head of the Jacksonville University Public Policy Institute, covering a lot of ground here and still more to cover. We now have an expanded battle for the Sun Belt, the Rust Belt, especially the Sun Belt, that was out of reach for Joe Biden, no doubt. Chuck Coughlin, a longtime Republican consultant in Arizona, said the switch from Biden to Harris was a jolt in his state and beyond. Here's what he said. Once he stepped aside, meaning Biden, it was as if you released a torrent of energy. However, the immediate reaction from Trump's campaign suggests they won't alter the arguments they were making before Harris tapped walls. Has the equation changed?
Clearly, the equation has changed. They are no longer running against Joe Biden. That was a very different race. The Harris-Walz ticket is a fundamentally different one. But the fundamentals of the policy debate remain the same. And as I said earlier, the question is, does the Republican Party, does Donald Trump have the discipline to tie Kamala Harris really to two things in particular? Number one is the Biden record. Although Biden touts the record, and Harris does too, and Republicans attack it, the most important thing may be how does the public view it? And the public in three areas really views it negatively, and that's in terms of inflation, the number one issue really for many Americans. Number two is immigration, what we've seen over the last 4 years, and of course, energy policy and crime. And does that equation remains the same, whether it's Biden or Harris, but I think the Trump campaign has not been as effective as tying Harris to all of those Biden policies. The second is her policy record. They're giving her sort of an opportunity to redefine herself. She's been in public life for a number of decades, and her record as U.S. Senator has been ranked as very, very liberal. As I mentioned earlier, from fracking to defunding the police to abolishing private health insurance to defunding ICE to decriminalizing illegal entry into the country, she has a record that the Trump campaign can argue if they are going to be disciplined about it. So we're going to have to wait and see how all this rolls out, but that is going to be the challenge for the Trump campaign.
Even if you look at her record as Attorney General in California, she is not necessarily as progressive as many people think.
Well, she is highlighting those areas where she was not. She's starting to talk about taking on big corporations. She's talking about the border. She's now redefining herself and deploying more to the border. And so I do think she and her campaign have been pretty savvy politically, and that is the strength. Right now, it's the policy debate. I give the Republicans and the Trump side the edge on the policy debate when it comes to those swing voters, but I give the Harris campaign right now the political debate. And one of the things we've learned over the past is that when it comes to winning elections, politics tends to trump policy. What you have to do is use that policy to your political advantage. And so far, the Trump campaign has been a little off their game. I do expect this to be very competitive. Like I said, post-Democratic convention. They need to brace themselves. The honeymoon's going to continue on the Harris side. They're going to get a bump next week. She's going to define herself, and then it's race on.
And nothing's going to happen during the Democratic convention. I mean, you know, she's officially the nominee. We're not going to find out anything new about the platform. This is all just pomp and circumstance.
It is, but it's going to be helpful to her. No, there's no mystery. It's going to be a great outpouring for Joe Biden. There's going to be great support for her. But you're going to see, as you saw with the Republican convention, I expect a very unified Democratic Party, just as you saw a very unified Republican Party. And you're going to, again, what they want to do is bring that base home. They want those young voters coming to the Democratic side. They want that black vote to be consolidated. They want the Hispanic vote. They want those women. And if they can do that, that makes them more effective in those battleground states and throughout the country. So I expect it to give them a boost. Just as the Republican convention was a very strong and powerful campaign for the Republicans, they were very, very unified. It did give them a boost that was somewhat short-lived because a couple days after that convention, Joe Biden dropped out, and then there was a shift in focus to the Democratic side.
Yeah, I'm curious to see the Gen Z vote, the TikTok vote, and the black vote, and the Latino vote. I'm curious to see what they do to capitalize on that in the convention and afterwards. And look at history here. Trump narrowly won the blue wall states. We talked about this in the 2016 race against Hillary Clinton, only to lose them 4 years later to Biden, who also added Georgia and Arizona to his winning coalition. He's going after Brian Kemp. If he can bring Georgia, Trump into the fold, that could change the equation. And Arizona, too, is interesting here. You know,
you've mentioned the blue wall, of course, when we talk about that, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And then we talk about, of course, that Sun Belt, you're really taking, and the Rust Belt. But if you look to Arizona and Nevada out west, if you look at Georgia and North Carolina in the south, you look to the Rust Belt, the blue wall, Those 7 states, many believe, and I certainly agree, that that is so much of where this battle is being fought. And as I said earlier, I think the Democratic strategy has been very clear, and they've been effective so far. For them, the challenge lies ahead when Kamala Harris does do an interview, which she has effectively avoided so far, when she does debate on September 10th. Those will be important parts of this campaign, so much lies ahead. On the Republican side, are they going to be able to execute a strategy effectively and stay on message, or are they not?
Like you said, who knows? More recently, after Biden's disastrous debate performance in June, the 81-year-old's options narrowed. Trump was ready to capitalize across the electoral map. Then the former president emerged even stronger when he survived the assassination attempt. So who knows? Rick, a lot of campaign strategists who say the Trump campaign needs that reboot, even people within the campaign. But the worry is they don't know how to get there. And if you look, he's grappling for traction. He's tied Harris to the unpopular Biden administration and policies, the economy, the world's a dangerous place. Trump still harps on personal grievances and personal attacks. He's now asking for 3 debates. Harris agreed to only 1 so far. He has no delusion that if he can get her on the debate stage, he's worrying she'll falter. How do you think she'll perform?
Well, it's interesting to take a look at her track record and to look at Kamala Harris. She has shown, and she's shown it over the last few weeks, that she's very good with a script. And she's very good at giving a speech. And if you look at her debate performances back in 2019, you have seen that Kamala Harris has the ability to prepare and deliver a punch, as she did to Joe Biden in 2019. And she had a bit of a rise when she prepared an attack on Joe Biden. She also showed, however, that she's not as good at taking a punch. And Tulsi Gabbard, back in the debate in 2019, came close to that debate performance alone when she took on Kamala Harris, really knocked her out of the race. Kamala Harris has shown in those debates she's not nearly as good on her feet in answering questions as she is with the script and the teleprompter. I think the reason the Trump campaign agreed to the September debate on ABC, which is kind of an away game for them, is they want her to answer questions because they believe that is a vulnerability for her. They want her to do interviews because they believe that is a vulnerability for her. I think the Democratic campaign is buying some time to get her briefed up on some of these areas. But if Donald Trump has called for 3 debates, there will be 1. Whether we see more than that, I'm not so sure. I think the Harris campaign is going to make a judgment as to what serves their interest in winning. And it's very possible they're going to stick with 1 debate because that is an area of potential vulnerability for Kamala Harris.
She is a savvier politician now than she was 4 years ago. So whether there are more debates contingent upon how she performs in this first one and what kind of political collateral might be at stake?
Yes, and I think if she performs well, there's a really good chance she won't do another debate either because that'll give her the momentum. Say, I've already done well. Because
I've got nothing more to prove.
I've got nothing more to prove because it is a vulnerability. The policy side for Kamala Harris is a challenge because of her track record as a United States Senator and because of her track record as Vice President. Remember, as Vice President, she's the President of the Senate. She's cast some of the deciding votes on some of the legislation with Joe Biden. She is very much tied to the Biden agenda and the Biden policies. And despite the touting of those policies on the Democratic side, as I mentioned earlier, public opinion polling suggests big dissatisfaction with inflation, immigration, energy policy, and crime. And for Kamala Harris, that is a real vulnerability. And so far, during this honeymoon period, she has effectively avoided that vulnerability. If I'm on the Harris side, I get some friendly journalists in a room, and I have some friendly questions, I have some prepared answers, and I try to do away with that sort of criticism. And I try to get to Election Day with as few interviews as possible and few debates as possible and leave her to the retail politics, delivering speeches, and being the happier warrior you described earlier.
Why take chances when you don't have to?
Exactly right.
Yeah. Let's focus on control of the Senate. Senate Democrats facing tough re-election campaigns in battleground states were nowhere to be found when Joe Biden's political prospects took a nosedive, and it became more noticeable after that debate debacle. Harris is bringing them back into the fold, a sign how dramatically the race has changed.
The short answer is yes, it is. And remember a phenomenon that we've seen in recent years, which is this ticket splitting. In recent years, how you vote at the top of the ticket has very much been how, there's some exceptions, but not many, is how you vote down ballot. And Joe Biden himself this past week in an interview said one of the motivating reasons for actually getting out of the race was his concern from colleagues in the House and Senate that he was going to be a drag on their reelection prospects. And so with Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket, it has been a change, and it's been a change in those base voters I mentioned earlier, the youth vote, the black vote, Hispanics, women, and they're hopefully turning them out. Remember this. The Senate map this November dramatically favors the Republicans. Out of the 33 races, 23 of those races are Democrats defending. And that means 23 opportunities for the Republicans to flip a Senate seat. And one of those is going to go Republican, which is West Virginia. And there are other competitive ones. So the Senate is going to be important. This switch to Kamala Harris makes it far more competitive on the Democratic side. On the Senate side, you give a slight advantage to the Republicans, in part because of the map. But, Bruce, this is going to be very, very competitive come November.
But even if she wins in November, there's no guarantee that they gain control of the Senate.
There is not. She could, because it's going to be a close race. And although there is that ticket splitting issue, it will be more competitive. But the map, this is the year for the Republicans. If they're going to regain the Senate, it really needs to be this year. 2 years out, it's going to be far, far more difficult. So it is possible you could see that split.
And in many respects, control of the House is even more important.
Now, all 435 of those are up, and that is a razor-thin margin right now. And so that is going to be very, very competitive. That one is too close to call.
Yeah, it really is. So let's move on to, you mentioned, by the way, Joe Manchin. I just want to briefly point out, that's a lost cause for the Democrats.
Absolutely. That West Virginia seat is Democrat. That's going Republican.
All right. Joe Biden, he recently did an interview, and you can't ignore the bombshell from the president. He says he's not confident of a peaceful transition of power if Donald Trump loses the election. He pointed to comments made by the former president himself. The Republican nominee suggested in the past the only way he'd lose if the election is stolen from him. If Trump loses, do we see a nation that's more divided and in more turmoil than we saw after the last election cycle, if that's even possible?
Bruce, we all know it's a divided country. The partisan divide is enormous and real. Whoever loses, the divide is going to deepen. Donald Trump was asked this question. I don't expect there to be an interference with the peaceful transition of power come next year. I think that's going to happen. But do I think that it's going to be a divide? Yes. Do I think it's going to be worse than even now? Yes, because winning and losing is going to be hard for whoever is on the losing side of this. So it's one of the great challenges we face, quite frankly, as a country. We talk about this a lot at the Public Policy Institute at Jacksonville University, this need to take on the partisan divide, this need for the country to be able to speak to each other without viewing those who disagree with you as being the enemy, to talk about challenges we face and find common solutions. That's all just general talk. And the reality is that in those trenches, there is a divide that's deep and real, and each side tends to view the other side with disdain, and even worse, contempt. It gets even deeper.
But does he further rile the nation?
If he loses, he will rile the nation. But I think, as our institution showed, our institutions will withstand that. I expect whoever loses, this will be very, very difficult. He can't. He's one of those people who goes back.
He can't help himself.
He goes back when he's talking about the 2020 election, when he's disparaging others, when he's attacking Brian Kemp in Georgia. He's off message and he's hurting himself. When he's talking about his record as president, when he's going after the country in the last 4 years, I think he has a chance to be successful. But your question is, post-election, what's it going to look like? I fully expect a peaceful transition of power. If Donald Trump loses, I certainly expect that he will be airing grievances about that. But in the end, I'm very confident that our institutions are going to withstand this very successfully.
And then there's the question, people say, if he wins, is democracy at stake? I don't think democracy is ever at stake here in this United States.
Well, we had Ernie Miller, the former doctor at University Hospital, used to always say, when I had him on the witness stand, that the best indication of future conduct is past conduct. And so I think for Donald Trump, what do you expect in his term? You saw him for a first term. You saw his 4 years. I think people have forgotten that it's somewhat chaotic. It can be very disruptive. But they will point to is a time of low inflation. They will point to a strong economy, a move away from free trade, a little more protectionist. You can see in the future maybe a little more isolationist. So he's going to argue that his policies were successful, but certainly if you want a sense of what the future looks like, take a look at what you've seen in the past.
But we both know that the president really has nothing to do with the economy. The economy is cyclical. Isolationist, for sure. more tariffs on foreign countries, what that does to the economy. It's all speculative.
It's going to be a part of a healthy debate on September 10th. I'm biased. I'm hoping there are 3 debates because we cover them here at Channel 4. I believe the public discussion of these issues are important. I believe in a presidential race, the leading candidates from both parties should be answering questions. I like the change in format in which there's no studio audience, in which they cut off the microphones. That was one of the positives to come out of the June debate. We need to have this public discussion. We need to have this public debate. We need to have the discussion of foreign policy and isolationism, economic policy on taxes and spending, and of course, everything from immigration to energy policy, healthcare. We need to have that discussion, and I hope we do.
And I also wish that the moderator had the wherewithal and the permission to go answer the darn question, but we don't.
I do think the follow-up question becomes important, and I'll make this prediction for September 10th. Both candidates will exercise the practice of not answering the question, which is one of my pet peeves. I wish they would be responsive to the question. Instead, they will pivot to their talking points. Donald Trump certainly did that in the last debate. Oftentimes you saw Joe Biden do it. I think Donald Trump more. In this next debate, one of the predictions that I'm confident of is that both candidates will not be answering the questions.
And to that, Rick, I will tell you something that I tell my wife all the time, though I don't always believe it with her, but I do in answering you. You're absolutely right. Appreciate you being here on Path to the Polls. And by the way, there are some debates that you'll find very interesting concerning a couple of the amendments that will provide you with some, needed information before you do go to the polls. Again, Rick, thanks for being here. By the way, encore performance of Path to the Polls tonight at 7. You can watch it streaming on demand anytime on the News4Jax YouTube channel, news4jax.com. And if you want to weigh in, always appreciate you sending an email. And if we're not on the same page, let's just agree to disagree in a very agreeable way. Have a great day.
See why every day more people are choosing News4Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.